You say that to my face. Hey everybody, SC Closer here. Friends call me Vic. I got another episode of Vic C Stories and Tall Tales today. Today I pulled this out of the closet. If y'all can see it there. This is my Tripoli shirt from when we went to Vancouver. That would have been probably, I'm thinking it was probably around 89. And so this kind of reminded me of a story. I really don't have a real good story about Vancouver. I remember that's the first time I ever had Labatt's beer. We had it, we bought about a pint. It was on tap. That was pretty good. But it was raining a good bit of the time we were there. And we just kind of walked around and kind of toured the place. I mean, you know, you had some very nice buildings around there. Everybody acted really nice and everything. It's just I don't really have any real good stories about Vancouver. But when I think about Vancouver, what I remember about Vancouver was something that happened on the ship. And that's what I'll talk about today. Now, to set this up for you, I got to let you know what happened before we got to Vancouver. So before we were in Vancouver, we had stopped in Alameda. Alameda's right over by Oakland in the San Francisco Bay Area. And we used to have a Navy base over there. I guess it's still there. I don't know. And while we were in Alameda, we were steaming. So we had to stand watching on the ship. At that time, being senior second class, I was in charge of the watch bill. So I was making out the watch bill. And we had a fella, that one guy, you remember out of my other story, I think that was episode 2, that one guy. Well, we'll call him Rob. And Rob came to me, and well, actually he went to EM1, who was the first class, and he asked EM1 if he could get off for a while. He technically had duty that day. And he was wanting to know if he could leave the ship for a while because he wanted to go, because we were on base, he wanted to go and wash his clothes or something like that. EM1 told him, he said, you know, I don't make the watch bill. That's Vic's job. You know, he says, he's the turn 2 PO. You need to talk to him. So I heard EM1 tell him this. So, you know, EM1 sends him to me. Now, I'm going to tell you, EM1 was a really nice guy. I don't think he would have let Rob leave the ship. Okay, Rob's kind of unreliable, right? I know the second class that was making the watch bills before he left the ship, before I took over. I know he wouldn't let him off the ship. And I don't think the one before him would have either. But Rob came to me, and he was asking me, you know, if I could allow him to leave the ship, you know, and he would be back in time for his watch. And it was my, you know, EM1 told me it was my decision. And so I looked at him, I said, all right, Rob, I said, I'm going to tell you what, I said, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to treat you like I would anybody else. And I said, I'm going to let you go. I said, but you better be back in plenty of time, and you better not be late for your watch. You better be back. I said, don't mess with me now. I said, because if you screw me over, that's it. I said, you know, you'll never get another favor out of me. And he promised that he would be back. And so I let him go. EM1 looked at me later and says, Vic, I don't know if you should have let him go. But I said, well, I'm going to give him a chance. You know, I'm going to give him a chance. So, long story short, he made it back. He came back in time. So, you know, no problems. From Alameda, at some point after that, we went to Vancouver. And we're now in Vancouver. All right, I was off, and a lot of us were off. Some people were on duty. And we went into town and stuff, but a lot of us came back. Like I said, for whatever reason, you know, we wasn't, I don't know what the deal was. There just wasn't much going on. We decided to come back to the ship. And so we came back that night. While I was on board the ship that night, they had an engineering casualty. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it had something to do with the generator, because we were steaming while we were, while we were there. And so the power went out, and they called it over to one MC that there was some sort of a casualty. So I ran down to main control right away. I forgot who was on watch down there, but he normally manned something else when there was a casualty. So I ran down to main control. Now I was the senior electrician on the ship, I think, at the time, because most everybody was gone. So I went down there, and the engineering officer to watch was BTC Hubbard. He was down there. And so I went down there and took over the switchboard. Whoever was on watch, I don't remember who it was, he went to his normal position that he would go. And the duty section, all those people went where they needed to go. But we were a little bit short-handed. So I told messenger of the watch, I said, I need you to go down to the berthing area and go over to where the electricians sleep and everything, and see if you can find some folks, that might be on board. I said, because we need some people. Well, about that time, I was on my headset. I was getting calls that different guys that were on the ship, heard the call, and they went to their stations. But we still needed somebody to man one of the switchboards in one of the diesel generators. And so we were trying to find somebody. So Sweeney was the messenger to watch. So Sweeney went down and he looked, and he came back. And the engineering officer to watch asked him, he says, did you find any more electricians? He goes, well, yeah. He says, I found one, but he said that he wasn't on duty, so he wasn't going to get up. And I said, well, who is it? He said, it was Rob, So I told him, I said, go back down there and tell Rob that I said for him to get up and go down there and man number 1 diesel switchboard, because we are having a casualty and we need them down there. And he said, okay. So Sweeney left. Sweeney comes back, and I asked him, I said, did you get Rob up? He goes, no, he cussed me out. He said he wouldn't come down here. And I said, well, what did he say? I said, you tell him I said for him to go down there? And he said, yeah, he told me to tell you to go, what? And I said, he did. And I looked over at Chief Hubbard. He was the engineering officer, and he looked at me, and I was pretty ticked. I was pretty mad. And Hubbard looked at me and said, he said, Vic, would you like to go down there and wake Rob up yourself? And I said, yes, I would. And he said, okay. He says, I hereby relieve you of your watch. I'll take your watch. You go down there and you deal with Rob. And everybody was starting to laugh because they knew what was about to happen to Rob, okay? So I was properly relieved. I left. I went down there. And I went down there, and first thing I did is I snatched his curtains open, and I started yelling at him. I said, Rob, I basically was like, what the hell? I said, you want me to do what? You say that to my face. And he just was freaking out, and everybody was laughing around us. Long story short, Rob manned that post pretty quickly after I went down and had a little talk with him. And that is the story that I remember about Vancouver.